You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 81, covering the week of July 17th through July 21st, 2017. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, always a little housekeeping. If you do like this podcast, please share it around on social media, and you can find us on social media at the following places. On Facebook, you can find us at Abbeville Institute, so you can like us there. If you want to follow us on Twitter, just go out and look for Abbeville INST, and you can subscribe to our YouTube page. Also, remember that we do exist on your generous contributions alone. If you do like the podcast, the programs, and all the things we do on the website, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute. You can do so by going to abbevilleinstitute.org at the top of the page. Click on the little menu where it says Support Memberships for Individuals, and we have various membership options. You can donate monthly, as little as $3 a month if you are a student, or $5 a month if you're not a student, or you can donate annually. We have a $25 annual donation for a student, or a $50 annual donation starting at if you're not a student, and of course, we have various options beyond that. So please consider doing those things. Now, let's talk about also, if you want to get on our email list, this is one thing I forgot to mention. If you want to get on our email list, go on out to abbevilleinstitute.org and give us an email address, and we'll send you our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email on Saturday, which includes this podcast, along with an article of interest and the articles from the week as well. So it's also a way for us to communicate with you when we have programs coming up or other things going on at the Institute. So please consider doing that. It's painless, it's free, and you do get Kirkpatrick Sale's Emancipation Hell as a gift to your inbox. So all that great stuff is out there waiting for you if you just head on over to abbevilleinstitute.org. Okay, let's talk about the material for the week then. This is our first week back from the summer school. We had a really good summer school, the 15th annual summer school, and I was happy to be able to participate in that. We had a lot of good lectures and great material. We'll be putting the lectures online in the very near future, so you can go on out there and listen to those if you were not able to attend. And if you were able to attend, you can listen to them again. So one of the major themes at the summer school, it was a discussion of Southern identity and how does a Southerner cope with the attack on the South. How do you maintain Southern identity in the face of such withering assaults? I think that in so many ways the South has not been under this much fire since the early days of Reconstruction. It is tremendous in what's going on. Of course, there was just the vote in Tampa this past week to take down another Confederate monument. And so what we wanted to do there was try to explain that, first of all, this is not new. My talk on the New South explained that, Southerners were still under attack in the early 20th century and late 19th century, but that actually galvanized a Southern identity. And I think that's something that we hope would come out of this. Southerners are going to hopefully realize, we are under attack, and we need to galvanize our support for each other and push back against some of this stuff. Unfortunately, because of some of the institutional apparatuses that have been set in place, which we'll talk about for the piece that ran on Friday this week, that's a much more difficult task than it was in the early 20th century, when your major universities and higher education institutions in the South were still dominated by Southerners, and those who viewed themselves as Southern, even if they didn't always agree with the policies of the South at the time, or they had critiques of the South, they still identified as Southern, and they still promoted a Southern culture. But nowadays, you just don't have as much of that. So the systematic dismantling of this Southern identity has been pretty thorough in the last, say, 40 to 50 years. And hopefully things like the Abbeville Institute will help push back against this. This is what the goal of the Institute is to educate and create this type of unity among Southern people and an understanding of who they are, and give them the ammunition to fight back. You're going to have people attacking you relentlessly in the future, so it's it's important that we understand what Southern identity means, what the basis of that is. And when I was in a seminar with students, and I posed the question: Can a Southern identity still survive without, say, a farm? Is it only occupation? Is it so? What is it that makes people Southern? And one student said, "Well, it's something that you just don't think about. It's just something you are." But one of the things that came out of that, and of course we've run an article about that, is manners. If you look around at American society today, there's very little in the way of manners. Particularly on social media, it's just a free-for-all. People are rude, abusive, and so manners are lacking among people that engage each other. Now, I think that in a more personal environment, you would not see so much in the way of abuse, because you're standing in front of someone and there's always a reprisal or repercussions for that. But online, it's anonymity, or even if you're not anonymous, you're still sitting behind a computer and you don't have to see this person. And so we engage in discussion and other things in a less civilized way. And I think this is carried out into many other ways, many other facets of American society as well. People have far less respect for each other than they used to. And so one of the things we could do about that in the South, I think, is to engage in a dose of culture and civilization through manners. When people don't act in a civilized way without showing manners, they're barbarians. And that's what we have to start calling people out on this. And so I would hope that part of Southern society could be rekindled among Abbeville Institute listeners and followers. And even when you don't like people, you can still have manners towards them and still at least engage them, as Clyde Wilson pointed out, as another fallen soul, another imperfect soul. And that is the thing that made the South what it was in so many ways, was manners. And of course, we ran an article about that and put it out in our weekly email last week. So I think that that is one thing that could help salvage this Southern identity. But beyond that, we had a heavy dose of literature at the summer school. A lot of discussion about people like Flannery O'Connor and others, and so and Faulkner, of course. So this week we started out with a poetry sampler, and one of the things that I think one of the enduring qualities about the South is its literature, and Southerners have a story to tell. And the point made at the summer school is that Southerners have a soul, and you have to have that. But more importantly, I think that the thing that makes Southern literature so good is it's a story of home and a people that have an identity. And Flannery O'Connor used to say that Southerners can talk about the odd because they can recognize it for what it is. And so I think it's important to kindle, and to foster this Southern identity through literature. And these two poems, they're by Abbeville scholars, people that have written for us before. They're not poems that are taken out of some dusty anthology somewhere. Southerners are still writing good material. And we need to encourage that. And so every now and then we will run new works of poetry or original short stories and things like that at the Abbeville Institute. So these particular poems, first two are written by Walt Garlington, and the third by Stephen Borthwick. And Stephen Borthwick actually wrote a wonderful little piece about Orthodox Christianity in the South. And how it's growing, and why it's growing, and so I think that was that was a very interesting piece. But this particular poem that he wrote it's very good. It kind of integrates this relationship between the Old South and the New, and what's going on there, where we have modernity combating this old agrarian tradition, and I think it's a wonderful little expression of that. And Same thing with Garlington's Dirt Dauber, and it talks about, it's this conflict between modernity and nature, and through the eyes of a dirt dauber, in so many ways, or at least the killing of a dirt dauber. And the patriarch's clan, again, this bond between family. And I think that one of the things that was pointed out between, say, Faulkner and other writers, Hemingway, for example, the difference between them is that at the summer school is that, Faulkner talked about granddaddy. Granddaddy said this, or daddy said this, and Hemingway never brought that up. There was that continuity between family in Southern literature, that tie in family relationships that is very important in the Southern tradition. Where are you from? To identify family, to identify people that you relate with. And I think that's an important part of understanding the Southern tradition, because clan and community are very important in the South. Where you come from, where are your genes, who's your blood, who are your kin. And it's not to say that these things aren't important in other places, but it's the way that they're explained in the South and identified in the South that make them unique, I think, in some ways, in terms of the Southern identity. So these are wonderful little poems. It doesn't take long to read them. And I know that a lot of times when we run literature like this, people don't read it as much because it's not something political. Our political pieces always get more traction. But I think it's important to have a little poetry in your life. You should always read a little poetry, read a little literature, so you can identify with the people around you. And on that, in that regard, we ran a book review on Tuesday by Randall Ivey on Catherine Savage Brosman's The Southern Women Writers and the Vision of Goodness. And she was one of our speakers at the summer school and did a very good job. She is an excellent poet. And this particular piece is focused on this book that she wrote. And, of course, Randall Ivey is one of our scholars as well. He's a very good author in his own right and writes excellent little short stories. We've run several of them on the website. And this is an interesting book. One of the reasons why, and Mr. Ivey points this out, that to call them Southwestern writers is a little bit might be disconcerting, he says, because Willa Cather, who was from Virginia but reared in Nebraska, she spent most of her life in the Northeast, but she would travel to the Southwest and write about that particular region. And so it's bringing these people to our consciousness today. A lot of people don't even know who Willa Cather is. And I think that that's the important part of this book. But it's also important that to understand why Dr. Brosman brings these people to the fore. And so Mr. Ivey points that out. He says, for a traditionalist, Brosman is well-versed in contemporary literary theory and does not ignore it. But she does not allow her subjects to become cardboard cutouts for some particular political cause or series of esocentrisms. And so this is important to understand. It's not putting these people within, they're a feminist, but that's all they are. And she brings out she gives these characters, these people, depth, these writers depth, and understanding where they are and who they are. And of course, where they're from, and that's that identity that we have to get out of this stuff. And so normally, Dr. Brosman is writing poetry, and we're actually going to publish some of her poems in a couple of weeks on the website. But this is a very good book in terms of, as an academic work. It's published by McFarland Press, but it's very good in bringing out who these writers were and why they still are important. And I think that's something that we have to understand. We have to, where these people come from. For example, Willa Cather comes from Virginia and Nebraska, but where they come from is important. Where you're from matters in how you view the world. And so Mr. Ivy did a very nice job with this review, and if you are interested in Southern literature, I would recommend picking up this particular book by Dr. Brosman, Southwestern Women Writers and the Vision of Goodness. Now, carrying forward on the artistic theme, we ran a piece on Wednesday entitled Leave the Monuments Alone, an Artistic Perspective by Dr. Juliet Peers. And Dr. Peers is a lecturer in Melbourne, Australia. And so she's not from the South. She looks at Confederate monuments through a world perspective, and I think that's important. People in the United States focus on these things purely in a very distorted way, particularly those that are against these monuments and want to take them down. But she brings a nice international perspective on what these monuments mean and what taking them down means. From an artist. And so her point is we should leave these things alone because they're works of art. Leave them where they are, even in the public spaces, because they were put there for a reason, as not just as a symbol of memorial, as a memorial symbol, but as a work of art. And she has a very good point. She says, quote, "Besides Confederate monuments, no other artwork pay so spectacularly for the sins of their originating culture. Elastic tolerance is directed towards artworks from other societies whose values differ substantially from present-day norms. Much admired historic art includes Greeks, Roman, Egyptian, pre-Columbian, which was produced in societies where slavery and oppressed labor flourished, as to some African, Asian, Oceanic, and Middle Eastern artifacts. Some Third Reich artworks are granted art historical traction, and Maoist and Stalinist imagery is warmly regarded as popular kitsch, in both instances sidelining the state-endorsed crimes behind the artwork's political context. The revelations of systematic abuse of children and First Nation peoples by various churches currently makes no real impact upon the display of historical Christian art. Islamic art and architecture is separated from the popular tabloid stereotyping of Muslims as terrorists." So, again, all these other cultures, communities, are allowed to have their art on public display everywhere. The Romans were a much more brutal slaveholding people than the Confederacy ever was. So, and same thing with the Egyptians and the pre-Columbian peoples and the African societies. I mean, the Muslim societies, which were enslaving Africans long before Europeans ever were. But all these things are allowed to exist. You look at, Stalinist art. This stuff is awful. The Stalinist regime was, in so many ways, worse than the Nazi regime in terms of genocide, and yet they're allowed. These communist monuments still are sitting all around Russia. They weren't taken down. Sitting all around Eastern Europe, they weren't taken down. You still have Nazi artwork and Nazi buildings that were half completed in Germany that weren't bulldozed. It's amazing that these things are still allowed to exist, and yet a Confederate soldiers monument, a dedication to people who died, and memorial are being moved and taken down, destroyed, vandalized. So I think it's important to understand, and she points out people like Rhodes in England, his statues have been allowed to stay, even though Rhodes is so commonly vilified for his interest in Africa and the country of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. But these things are allowed to exist, and yet a simple soldier's monument somehow offends people so much that it has to come down, and this is blocking progress in America when it does nothing to help alleviate crime or poor education or any of these things. This is just a deflection for real problems. And as we're going to get into on the piece on Friday, and explaining why this is going on. But it's important to understand these things from an artistic perspective, and I think that's something that's often lost. These things are beautiful works of art. These monuments, they're wonderful. And so if we don't understand them from that perspective, we are really missing the boat. And people need to be defending them from a variety of different ways and pointing out the hypocrisy behind taking these monuments down. We're just not doing a very good job of it. And of course, the political traction because of guilt, supposed guilt, is all against us. But this is emotivism of the worst kind. It's voting with your heart and not with your mind. And unfortunately, it's voting with your heart in an improper way. But there's a great modern philosopher, Alcidaire MacIntyre, who has written about this. And, motivism as a real problem moving forward in politics. So I think that's one of the major issues we're confronted with today, is this emotional response to things, which is just, it's illogical, of course. But this is how people vote. And one thing you'll see if you look at how people interact with each other, and I see it with students all the time, when they answer a question, they say, I feel, instead of I think. And that is an important distinction to make. They feel everything instead of thinking about things. And so it's imperative that one of the things we try to do in discussing with people is saying you don't really feel these things. You think these things. And if you're feeling these things, then you're not thinking. And so start thinking. These attacks on Confederate memorials are not thinking. They're feeling. And it's irrational and illogical. All right. On Thursday, we ran a piece entitled the Poe's War of the Literati. And this is about Edgar Allan Poe. And a lot of people don't... Look, Poe is one of the few people that's a Southern literary figure who's still widely studied. You have Flannery O'Connor, and you have William Faulkner, and then you have Edgar Allan Poe. And that's because Poe was an honorary Yankee, as Clyde Wilson likes to point out. These people become honorary Yankees. Poe has been adopted as one of their own, with an honorary Yankee. Here he is. He's an American, meaning he's an honorary Yankee. But Poe was a Southerner to the core. In fact, when he was alive, he was attacking the North all the time, particularly through the Southern Literary Messenger, which he edited. And he was highly critical of Northern writers who would ignore everything from the South. And particularly in the 1840s, as the sectional conflict was heating up, Poe became much more rigid in his defense of the South and the Southern literary community. And Northerners picked up on this, and they started critiquing Poe quite extensively and started making up all the stories we have about Poe, that, he was this degenerate, drug addict, all these other things. A lot of that comes from Northern writers who wrote about Poe, who hated Poe after his death. They made up some of these things so that Poe would be thrown in the gutter, so to speak, and the South and the Southern literary tradition would be thrown in the gutter because Poe was so focused on saving it from Northern critics. And one of the main culprits in this particular assault against Poe was a Northern literary critic named Griswold. And I mean, just that name, Griswold, right? It sounds Yankee. But Griswold was highly critical of everything the South did. And then, of course, because Poe started defending the South, Griswold became highly critical of Poe. Poe, for example, was very laudatory of William Gilmore Simms. He called The Wigwam and the Cabin, Simms's work, The Wigwam and the Cabin, quote, the best novelist which this country has upon the whole produced. And he called Murder Will Out, which was another short story by Simms, the best ghost story ever written. And this is coming from Edgar Allan Poe. So it's important to understand, he loved A.B. Longstreet's Georgia Scenes, Poe did. And it's important to understand that this identity, this Southern identity, was taking place outside of these political discussions of slavery. Southerners knew themselves as consciously Southern, even in terms of literature. So Southern identity is larger than, and you'll have historians try to tell you it's only slavery or only race. Southern identity was larger than that. And it was found in literature as an expression of culture long before you had these, or even during the time of these political conflicts, but it was something deeper than that. And that's also an important part to bring out about Southern identity. It's something deeper than just politics. Again, all of our pieces on politics are quite well read. Those on culture and literature are not. But this is something that needs to be corrected if we're going to push back against this attack on the South. And this particular piece is written by Harry Lee Poe. Harry Lee Poe is a professor at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, and he's related to Edgar Allan Poe. He's written a number of books on theology and philosophy and, of course, on Poe. And this is a very good piece. And he concludes the piece with this: for all the responsible scholarship which has cleared Poe's reputation, Griswold and the Yankee literati won the war of the literati. The public has accepted the Griswold stories. Even this article was intended to discuss Poe as a proponent and defender of Southern writers, was required to stir Griswold's muck once again. And I think that's important. There were people trying to salvage Poe's reputation in the late 19th and early 20th century. But even when you go into a college classroom today and you're going to get a dose of Poe, you're going to get the Griswold attack. Just offhand, they just bring it out there. Even though there were people pushing back against this and explaining that it's a little bit, or not just a little bit, but it was fabricated by a person who hated Edgar Allan Poe. Now, why is all this happening? So finally on Friday we ran a piece entitled The Origins of the Neomarxist Attack on the South by Norman Black. And Mr. Black is a journalist. He's a great supporter of the Institute. And he followed up John Devaney's piece, Southern Identity and the Southern Tradition, which we published on the 5th of July, with an explanation of where this stuff comes from. And he points to Gramsci, who is an Italian Marxist, and he calls him a neo-Marxist. Now, the people like Gramsci believe that what you had to do, it was middle-class hegemony, as Black points out, consists of thoughts, which are in turn embedded into numerous cultural institutions which produce and reproduce it. So what we're looking at here is thought control. And according to Gramsci and his acolytes, the ruling class dominates, this is from Black, the ruling class dominates culturally diverse U.S. society through their cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony consists of their beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and mores, which have become the accepted cultural norm and universally valid dominant ideology, which then justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural and inevitable, perpetual and beneficial for everyone, rather than an artificial social construct that benefits only the ruling class. So what you have to do, what they start doing, is the Gramsci acolytes view society through terms like equality, fairness, and exploitation, and they do this to attack every element of traditional American society. And you find this all throughout our cultural and academic institutions today. And it's done almost unknowingly. The Gramsci critique of American society has become so saturated in mainstream pop culture and the mainstream academy that it's just done without people even realizing they're doing it. Ryan Walters sent me an email about a new HBO series that's going to come out after this Game of Thrones, which finishes up, which is in so many ways a disgusting portrayal of humanity. But this news series is going to be just as violent, but it's going to focus on the Confederacy, and it's a alternate universe in which the Confederacy won, and so it's going to have this Gramsci view that the South, I'm sure, is going to be demonic, and you're going to have these noble Northerners going out and trying to take out these awful Southerners. Because this idea of equality, fairness, exploitation, it's in everything. It saturates everything we do. And that comes from our academic institutions. The professors who gained tenure in the 60s now push this, and they hire their own little sycophants that think like them. There's no real diversity of thought. This is a disgusting trajectory in American political and social and cultural thought. But that's where we've gotten. And Gramsci, this neo-Marxist, what we would call cultural Marxism, is behind all of it. If you would tear down traditional America, and what do you replace it with is the question. Well, we replace it with these bland ideas of equality, fairness, and non-exploitation. But that's not really a culture. That's a negative. So what beautiful, what valuable or positive thing replaces that? Well, there's nothing to replace it. This is why the South is so much under attack, because it is a real culture that the neo-Marxists cannot stand, because it's traditional, and of course it's based heavily on Christianity. And so when you tear that down, you don't replace it with anything really, except for this very strange view of society. And that is the point. You replace it with nothing but these terms, these hollow terms like equality and fairness. What does that mean? And you replace it with a political conception. So, as Black points out, you really can't have a culture based on politics, but we try. I mean, this is essentially what's happening in America today. It's a culture based on politics. You can't do that. It has to be something deeper than that. It has to be a regional or group identity, clan, community. This is going back to literature. This is why these things are so important. A people, a place, home. That's why it's important to have a foundation of those things moving forward in terms of Southern identity. So all these pieces were wonderful. I hope you take the time to read them. Until next time, good day.